El máster interuniversitario en migraciones contemporáneas, de hecho, es una de las ofertas más completas para estudiar y formarse en las migraciones en el Estado español en la actualidad. Nosotros tratamos desde los aspectos legales, jurídicos, mercado de trabajo, políticas sociales, políticas públicas.
Es el resultado de la unión de dos universidades líderes en el tema y en la investigación sobre la inmigración, que son la Universidad de Barcelona y la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, a través de grupos de investigación como son el Instituto de Derecho Público y el CER-MIGRACIONS.
Los dos grupos tienen una larga experiencia, son grupos que trabajan desde disciplinas diferentes, la sociología, el derecho, la ciencia política, la antropología, la comunicación, y la finalidad es precisamente ofrecer un producto que sea a su vez interdisciplinar y centrado en la formación muy aplicada, muy práctica de los estudiantes que cursen este máster.
Es cierto que la realidad desborda esta perspectiva individual sobre las cuales nosotros vemos las migraciones, y además esta idea de abordar, ¿no?, a través de distintos módulos el fenómeno migratorio, yo creo que contribuye o es una herramienta a la cual los estudiantes en un futuro en su desarrollo profesional podrán ir mucho más allá de lo que es en principio su formación de origen.
Lo que me parece interesante es que las clases, además de profesores, las imparten también abogados, trabajadores en ONGs o del sector público, y por tanto yo creo que el máster te da la oportunidad de familiarizarte con aspectos del fenómeno migratorio, digamos, más prácticos.
El objetivo del módulo de mercado de trabajo es analizar la relación entre la inmigración y la esfera económica. Es una aproximación dinámica que contempla la diversidad de perfiles y trayectorias de las personas migrantes, y con un fuerte énfasis en las consecuencias para los procesos de integración laboral y social en distintos contextos.
El objetivo del módulo de políticas públicas y gestión de la diversidad es proporcionar una primera aproximación a las políticas públicas sobre el hecho migratorio, la diversidad cultural y las minorías étnicas en los distintos niveles de gestión, aunque con un fuerte énfasis en el ámbito local y en las políticas sectoriales más destacadas como salud, educación, vivienda, seguridad.
A través del módulo de prácticas, el máster ofrece al estudiante la posibilidad de realizar estancias en una diversidad de entidades vinculadas al ámbito de las migraciones.
Y en concreto, el módulo de migraciones y educación se preocupa por investigar desde una perspectiva comparativa internacional las condiciones de incorporación de los hijos e hijas de las migraciones internacionales en España, desde la perspectiva de la ciudadanía, desde la perspectiva de los derechos y desde la perspectiva de la clave para su integración social, que es el sistema educativo.
Hola, muy buenas tardes. Good afternoon, and many thanks to everyone for participating in this event organized by CER-MIGRACIONS and supported by IOM in Spain. Since the early 90s, IOM has been participating in regional and international initiatives addressing the issue of environment, in particular in humanitarian field with its response to natural disaster, but the organization has stepped up over the past 2 decades in engagement with global initiatives linked to the environment and climate change, such as the one that brings us today. As has been discussed over the past few days, the migration, environment, and climate change nexus has gained prominence as the theoretic politic area of national, regional, and global agendas. IOM recognizes that environmental degradation and climate change are key drivers of contemporary migration, and that millions of people are already and will be affected in the near future by extreme heat, drought, sea level rise, desertification, erosion, considering also that migration movement may have an impact of environment. Only a couple of days left until World Environment Day, 5th of June, which this year calls for urgent actions to revive our damaged ecosystem. We are losing and destroying the foundation of our survival and at alarming rates. Both the 2030 Agenda and the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, adopted in December 2018, recognize climate change, environmental degradation, and natural disaster as drivers of migration. The protection and revival of ecosystems all around the world for the benefit of people and nature is everyone's responsibility, and local and international organizations have a role to play in this commitment. To this end, I would like to thank the panelists who will join us today. My colleague, Dina Ionesco, Head of Migration, Environment and Climate Change Division at IOM, Amali Tower of World Economic Forum, and Juan Méndez, Regional Advisor for Latin America and the Caribbean of the Disaster Displacement Platform, who will address the challenge faced by local, international organizations in the face of environment and migration. Thank you very much and have a good time.
Thank you, Maria Jesús. In the name of the organization team, I welcome everyone that is watching us. My role in this roundtable will be to moderate and to organize the questions to our speakers today. We have three speakers: Dina Ionesco, Juan Carlos Méndez, Amali Tower. We will begin with Dina Ionesco. Dina Ionesco, as Maria Jesús just told us, is the head of the Migration, Environment and Climate Change Division at the UN Migration Agency. In this capacity, she oversees since 2015 IOM policies and programs related to the nexus between migration, environment, and climate change, and coordinates the IOM contributions to policy process, such as climate change negotiations. She's the co-author of the Atlas of Environment Migration and of numerous articles and publications. So we welcome Dina Ionesco, and you will be our first speaker. Gracias a todos y a todas también que están aquí hoy. Empezaremos con Dina Ionesco, que es la directora de la División de Migraciones, Medio Ambiente y Mudanza Climática de la OIM. Y bienvenidos a todos y a todas. Y Dina, you can start.
Yes, thank you so much, Thales. Thank you, Maria Jesús, and hello to everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation and for organizing such events. And yes, we are very close to celebrating World Environment Day. For today, what I've been asked to present a bit is to look at the why international organizations and why the UN should be in this migration, environment, and climate change domain, and to explain not only a bit the why, but also what we do. So in my presentation today, I will first of all just speak a bit about the story of migration, environment, and climate change from the perspective of an international intergovernmental organization. And then I will just present the how and what we do more concretely, and end maybe on a few just key messages and a rapid look into challenges and opportunities ahead. So first of all, I just wanted to say a few words about what I call the story or the long road that we have been through to be able today to have such events that connect migration issues and positive dimension of migration to environmental and climate change dimensions. So it's a story, so all stories come with once upon a time. So I would say for this one, once upon a time, maybe for years and years, we did not really connect how much the environment and the change in the environment impacts the way people adapt and move to this change. And once upon a time, there were climate negotiations where states were brought together to discuss solutions on how to address one of the most important questions that our world is facing, is the adverse impacts of climate change. And for many, many years, for 16 years of climate negotiation, there has been no discussion on migration. There has been no discussion on human mobility. Climate talks for 16 COPs were not considering, in fact, the impact of climate change on people's mobility, or on the lack of mobility, by the way, because a lot of people are trapped in very fragile and vulnerable situations. So I think the story of this is that at international level, there's a space where states discuss issues at multilateral international level to get to joint approaches and joint solutions and joint commitments on climate change. And it's very recent, in fact, that migration entered this space. But the story is that now it really entered this very strongly. So since the Cancun agreement in 2010, where states recognize that climate change has impacts on migration, on displacement, and on planned relocation, now in this world of the climate community and climate negotiations, there has always been now interest and focus on social dimension of climate change, and in particular on migration. And migrants bring, in a way, a face, in fact, to the reality of the impacts of climate change on humanity. So that's one side of the story, that's one side of the coin. It's the work that has been done to integrate, in fact, migration into the climate negotiations. So the Paris Agreement in 2015 now has also recognized the rights of migrants in its preamble, and has asked to create a task force on displacement that looks at averting and minimizing and addressing the adverse impacts of climate change. This task force, that it's made of 13 experts, and I had the chance to be part of this task force, and since the beginning to be part of the work of the task force, then has produced a lot of knowledge and mappings and work on capacities, on data, on evidence that was brought together in 2018 in recommendations that were then endorsed by the Warsaw Mechanism on Loss and Damage in a recommendation, in a decision called 1024 from Katowice, that continues, in fact, this mandate to work on migration and climate change through the climate lens. So we have now a number of tools and key anchorage with text that was negotiated by states and clear approaches to work on migration and displacement in the climate world. So in fact, we have work that goes in loss and damage. So looking more at displacement and also prevention of displacement to reduce the cost of damage and to reduce losses. And then you have migration also in terms of vulnerability, in terms of financing, in terms of capacities, and in terms also of adaptation questions. So we look also at migration in its adaptative dimension. So migration as an adaptation, also possible adaptation to climate change. So that's what I want to say a bit about the story on the climate side. Now, once upon a time, there's also the story of migration, international governance, the story of migration at international multilateral discussions. And there, I have to say, it has been even slower. So that's why we, as IOM, focused a lot on bringing migration in the climate world, where they were negotiating states around this topic, more than bringing climate issues in the migration world, because there it took ages for states to negotiate at international level. So in the migration world, once upon a time, states started to look at the environmental drivers of migration very late. And they started very late to go together in joint multilateral approaches to international migration, because migration is still the prerogative of states, and states want to remain in charge of that. So once upon a time, it took a long time. First of all, that's why in migration governance and migration management and multilateral level, as far as migration is concerned, you have a lot of dialogues. For instance, International Dialogue of Migration of IOM started 20 years ago. It's the oldest dialogue that exists. 10 years ago, we had the first dialogue on migration, environment, and climate change. And last week, 20 years later, we had again a dialogue on migration, environment, and climate change. And this is because we believe that at multilateral level, it's key for states in our today's world that they have a space where they can dialogue and exchange with civil society and with researchers, where data and evidence is brought to states, but it's still a dialogue. Once upon a time, in 2016, there has been one New York Declaration on migrants and refugees that led to the creation and adoption of compacts in 2018, a compact for safe, regular, and orderly migration, and a compact on refugees. And this compact, it's a game changer, even if it's not, let's say, compulsory. States negotiated, but it's up to them to then take ahead their commitments. But it's a key text that for the first time at international level, states negotiated a global text with commitments on migration that recognize also the tragedy of displacement and of forced form of migration, and the immense potential of migration and what it brings to countries, in particular home and destination countries, in terms of sustainable development and even migrants acting for climate action. So that was what I wanted first to say in my presentation today. It's this long story. We come from a very long way, and that's why I think it's key for international organizations that are intergovernmental like IOM, but that are the service of migrants. It's key for the UN to be able to engage both on the migration and the climate, the environment, desertification, ocean side, with innovative solutions that connect the issues, because we can't afford to be, as we have been once upon a time, ignoring that if you speak of environment degradation, if you don't protect the nature, you think that there won't be an impact on people's livelihoods and that you won't have an impact on human mobility. It's not possible. It's impossible. So now that I tried to make a real strong call for multilateralism, dialogue, joint approaches, and in particular regional joint approaches, I think that are key as far as migration and environment is concerned. I would like to finish my presentation on just giving you a few examples of how IOM concretely advances work on this topic. And for do that, I just want to highlight that the organization works around three main key objectives on migration, environment, and climate change. So the first key objective is to have a vision that if you invest in climate action, if you invest in building the resilience of people, if you invest in reducing their exposure to risk, if you reduce their exposure to disaster and to displacement, we then have a chance to limit for future generation the risk of forced form of migration and displacement. So our first objective is to invest in action in partnership with environmental, sustainable development, energy, ecosystem-based solution, agroecology, all the environmental players, to invest with all environmental players into programs that look at the protection of the environment to curb future forms of forced migration. And also we have quite a number of projects worldwide. More than 70 countries for last year were involved in such projects on disaster risk reduction. And that look also at the adaptative dimension of migration. So if you reduce the risk of disaster and you prepare the population and you work towards the resilience of population, we also diminish the risk of forced forward migration. So that's one of big space of the work we do with programs all over the world. Some very concrete like agroecology or blue economy in Kenya, agroecology in Morocco, to help population, in fact, have sustainable alternative livelihoods. The second big objective we have is to be realistic and to recognize that, unfortunately, climate change has an impact on people's mobility, and that we have millions of people displaced and newly displaced absolutely every year. And I encourage you to look at the GRID new report from IDMC that gives the latest figures on that are striking, and IOM really contributes with all our data to this report. So the second objective is to protect and to assist people who are on the move because of environmental, because of disaster due to natural hazards, because of the adverse impacts of climate change. So these are more like our humanitarian responses, our responses to disasters. And unfortunately, if you look at all floods in the world, or if you look at big typhoon seasons, if you look at different hazards to which people are exposed, and also long-term hazard like desertification, each time you will have this need to assist and protect people. And it's also a question of the protection of their human rights at all stages of their migration story and throughout also displacement, and proposing, for instance, clean energy solutions for displaced people. And the last objective I wanted to highlight, it's really looking at migration in a different way, in an innovative way. It's believing that migration can be part of the solutions, and that it's aligned with IOM's mandate on migration and with what I explained before, the Global Compact on Migration. It's about innovative migration practice. For instance, regional agreements, like we have the example of the IGAD, so Eastern Africa regional protocol that recognizes now disaster, displacement, and climate change dimensions. It's about thinking creatively about labor migration as a regular pathway, as a solution before it's too late. And we have examples from the Pacific, for instance, a program we are implementing now that really connects labor migration and climate change and migration. It's about visa. It's about humanitarian visa, temporary visa. It's about consular protection, everything you can imagine, very practical solution in terms of migration, to be prepared, in fact, for states to be prepared if this happens, that there are already solutions in place. So to conclude my presentation, I just want to highlight a few challenges and opportunities. I think one of the key challenge I see on this topic is that we are seeing a strong focus and a bit stubbornness on looking at this from a refugee perspective, and this climate refugee expression that comes all the time in the media, and that in fact does not exist in legal terms, because you can't be persecuted by climate change and you can't get in our contemporary world status as a refugee because of climate change. And it's so difficult to isolate climate change impacts from poverty, from labor issues, from economic, demographic conflict, that I think that if we only focus on this, we are narrowing ourselves, and it's an issue and a challenge. I think we need to have this broader vision of migration as possible solution, where you look at a wide range of possible options that are available for people who move in the context of disasters and of climate change, and especially slow degradation of the environment. And another thing I find very difficult now is that we manage to have now awareness, we have knowledge, we have evidence, we have anchorage in this key text, but to translate this into actual national revision of policies, national programs and projects, it's really not easy. It requires a lot of capacity of funding, and it requires states to be able to work across different areas, and it's very difficult. So I find that's two key challenges I wanted to highlight. And in the same time, I wanted to end on a positive note, because I think this topic, requires a lot of nuances, and to realize, as I said before, that you have situations that are tragic and very negative and sad, and what you lose, and people being displaced. But we have to keep also a key message of optimism and of positive, and once again to come back to the power of what migrants bring to sustainable development, in particular at local level, and how much migrants can contribute, in fact, themselves, even to climate action, and that this can be strongly encouraged, and it's part also of what IOM does. With this, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the other speakers and to the discussion.
Thank you, Dina, Ionesco. It was a pleasure to listen to you. For our audience, we will have the questions after the three speakers present to us their ideas. So we can go next to Juan Méndez. Juan Méndez es asesor regional para América Latina y Caribe de la plataforma de Disaster Displacement. So Juan Carlos is advisor for Latin America and Caribbean of the platform on disaster displacement, former Nansen initiative. He's an academic at the National University of Costa Rica and has several publications on human rights, migration, and cooperation. He has been an international consultant and has worked for the government of Costa Rica in different departments, including as an international affairs officer in the National Disaster Agency. So as we had in the other days, we are having a bilingual event. So all the audience and all the speakers are invited to speak or in Spanish or in English. So I give the word to Juan Carlos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Thales. Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to be part of this roundtable number 4, together with my colleagues, Dina Ionesco from IOM and Amali from Refugee International. I will use my 15 minutes to reflect on 3 topics: the kind of strategies that we, international organizations, use in addressing environmental migration. I will briefly highlight a couple of obstacles, and then I will finalize my intervention with a few ideas on what have been successful in this area, as you asked us. I want to thank the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, the Universidad de Barcelona, CER-MIGRACIONS, and IOM Spain for this kind of invitation to the platform on disaster displacement. If you don't mind, I will now switch to Spanish, my mother tongue. I think I feel more comfortable giving my presentation in Spanish. So on the first question on what are the current intervention strategies applied in support of environmental migrants? Lo primero que hay que decir es que, o puntualizar, es que no existe una homogeneidad en el abordaje de la migración ambiental a nivel internacional. Veamos, por ejemplo, la misma composición de este panel. Amali representa una organización no gubernamental, Dina representa una agencia de Naciones Unidas y yo trabajo para una iniciativa interestatal que es una suerte de híbrido que trabajamos con Naciones Unidas todos los días, pero que no formamos parte de la familia de Naciones Unidas. Cada agencia, cada organismo internacional diseña e implementa sus propias intervenciones de acuerdo a sus mandatos y, por supuesto, a sus posibilidades reales. Aquí nos encontramos frente a un abanico muy amplio de intervenciones que van desde la incidencia política hasta la misma respuesta humanitaria. Aquí nos encontramos, como muy bien decía Dina, con, por ejemplo, un gran trabajo de investigaciones aplicadas que han llevado a cabo OIM, nosotros y una gran cantidad de ONGs en todo el mundo, que tienen también como finalidad conocer lo que llamamos en inglés las root causes of migration, ¿verdad? Estas causas profundas de la migración y, por supuesto, el impacto que los efectos del cambio climático y los desastres tienen en la población global todos los años. Las últimas cifras del IDMC que Dina mencionó justamente nos vuelven a demostrar que recién hace un par de semanas fueron publicadas, nos vuelven a demostrar esta complejidad. Esto habla, por un lado, de lo compleja y poco homogénea que es la composición de la arquitectura internacional para el abordaje de este fenómeno de la movilidad humana en el contexto de desastres y cambio climático, pero además, cómo todo esto podría eventualmente derivar en algunas ocasiones en ciertos obstáculos para el cumplimiento de los objetivos planteados por la comunidad internacional, por las distintas agencias de Naciones Unidas, organismos internacionales, organizaciones no gubernamentales. Ciertamente, hay que decirlo, en el plano internacional, los organismos internacionales, incluidas las ONGs, enfrentan muchos obstáculos para el abordaje de la migración ambiental y el desplazamiento por desastres. Si me lo permiten, yo aquí podría resumirlo en unos 2 o 3 puntos que posiblemente Dina y Amali quizá lo comparten conmigo. En primer lugar, los organismos internacionales dependemos del apoyo y la voluntad de los mismos estados para realizar nuestro trabajo. Esto parece ser muy obvio, pero es importante resaltarlo. Es el caso, por ejemplo, de las mismas agencias de Naciones Unidas o de la iniciativa para la cual yo trabajo. Quizá para las ONGs puedan tener un poco más margen de maniobra, especialmente si los presupuestos no dependen directamente de los estados, pero en términos generales, todo este entramado de voluntad política se traduce en muchas ocasiones, lamentablemente, en recortes presupuestarios que afectan la labor y el impacto de nuestros proyectos en el terreno. En segundo lugar, dado esta poco homogénea, digamos, arquitectura internacional de la que les hablaba, es de esperar que en no pocas ocasiones exista duplicidad de funciones, inclusive de proyectos, y en algunos momentos los mandatos de toda la comunidad internacional se pueden traslapar en algún momento. Todo esto quizá pueda llevar en algunos casos que ustedes conocen a roces institucionales, dificultades administrativas y técnicas en el terreno que terminan afectando negativamente el accionar de toda la comunidad internacional y lamentablemente afectando a los beneficiarios finales, porque a final de cuentas lo importante de todo nuestro trabajo es poner en el centro de toda la ecuación política y administrativa y operativa a las personas que se encuentran en mayor situación de vulnerabilidad. Y ese debe ser nuestro espíritu. Otro de los obstáculos que enfrentamos los organismos internacionales a veces, en algunas ocasiones, es la falta de coherencia entre los planos globales y los planos nacionales. Por ejemplo, han existido algunas prácticas, quizá no tan positivas en el pasado, en donde desde oficinas en Ginebra o en Nueva York, quizá, se formulan proyectos o intervenciones que de repente no responden a las necesidades de las poblaciones más afectadas en el terreno, sino que podrían responder eventualmente a algunas aspiraciones personales de los técnicos que están detrás de las organizaciones, o inclusive presión política que viene desde otros niveles más arriba. Pero como ustedes sabrán, todo esto en todo caso es un una dificultad que enfrentamos quienes manejamos proyectos de cooperación internacional en todo el mundo, básicamente. Pero bueno, no quisiera tampoco culminar mi intervención con una nota, digamos, de pesimismo, sino también hacer referencia a la última pregunta que ustedes nos hacían, que tiene que ver con cuáles han sido esas iniciativas que han sido exitosas. Y aquí, bueno, aquí sería un poco, digamos, grosero resaltar unas y dejar unas por fuera, porque realmente la comunidad internacional ha hecho un gran trabajo en los últimos años visibilizando el tema en las agendas políticas globales y regionales. El trabajo, hay que decirlo, el trabajo de las organizaciones internacionales, incluidas las ONGs, ha sido vital para visibilizar y para mejorar el abordaje de los retos que implica la movilidad humana en el contexto de desastres y cambio climático. Pensemos, por ejemplo, en el trabajo que han realizado todo tipo de ONGs, las distintas agencias de Naciones Unidas, la misma Federación Internacional de la Cruz Roja y Media Luna Roja, inclusive de la Plataforma sobre Desplazamiento por Desastres, en incidir en los principales marcos internacionales para integrar todo tipo de consideraciones y de retos que hasta hace algunos años eran inexistentes. Como muy bien lo explicó Dina, fue sino hasta el año 2010, cuando en el Acuerdo de Cancún finalmente los países lograron acordar integrar estas tres dimensiones de la movilidad humana asociada a cambio climático: migración, desplazamiento forzado y reubicación planificada, o plan relocation, como se dice en inglés. Esto fue hace muy pocos años, en el 2010, y esto también es el producto de un gran trabajo detrás, de una gran maquinaria de incidencia de los organismos internacionales. Pero también pensemos en todo el trabajo que hemos realizado desde distintos frentes, por ejemplo, para tener un acuerdo de París que integra el tema claramente y, como muy bien decía Dina, crea por primera vez un Task Force on Displacement, que ya envió sus primeras recomendaciones acá en Katowice en el 2018. Pensemos también en el marco de Sendai para la reducción del riesgo de desastres y todo el trabajo político detrás para que el marco de Sendai tenga referencias claras sobre el tema de la movilidad humana y sus vínculos con la reducción del riesgo de desastres, incluido, por ejemplo, los riesgos transfronterizos de desplazamiento. Y, por supuesto, la misma agenda de protección de la iniciativa Nansen, para la cual yo he venido trabajando desde el año 2014. Todos estos instrumentos del año 2015, pero además, desde el 2018, este logro de la humanidad de un acuerdo como el Pacto Mundial sobre Migración, que si bien no es vinculante, ciertamente le da a la comunidad internacional una gran cantidad de luces y de prácticas por donde debemos abordar esta complejidad de la movilidad humana asociada a desastres y a cambio climático. Sin el apoyo de los organismos internacionales, de las ONGs, sin la incidencia política, la investigación, porque detrás hay mucho esfuerzo de investigación, de conocimiento, no hubiese sido posible adoptar este tipo de instrumentos globales. Para efectos, digamos, de mencionar en los pocos minutos que me quedan algunas prácticas, como decía al inicio, puede que sea un poco imposible resaltar cuáles han sido más o menos exitosas, dada la complejidad del tema en cuestión, de la migración ambiental o el desplazamiento por desastres. Pero a nivel global tenemos buenos ejemplos sobre la adopción, por ejemplo, de guías, algunas prácticas muy relevantes sobre reubicación planificada en el Pacífico, por ejemplo, que responde a la realidad de los países del Pacífico. Tenemos también en el Caribe, una región que yo también apoyo, una gran cantidad de prácticas muy interesantes que tienen que ver con evacuaciones, por ejemplo, preventivas, que tienen que ver con la posibilidad de que miles de personas salven sus vidas, por ejemplo, en el contexto de desastres repentinos. Y esta región de las Américas, América Latina y el Caribe, como ustedes sabrán, es una de las regiones más vulnerables a los impactos de los desastres. Estamos trabajando justamente la próxima semana en conjunto con los colegas de OIM, de GIZ y de la organización de Eastern Caribbean States. Justamente la próxima semana tenemos un training de 2 semanas con oficiales de migración, justamente previendo la próxima temporada de huracanes que inició formalmente hace 2 días. En América Latina tenemos grandes prácticas que tienen que ver con el uso positivo, discrecional de la legislación migratoria para la admisión y la protección de personas que se desplazan por desastres. América Latina tiene una gran cantidad de prácticas en este sentido. Pero bueno, ya para finalizar, yo diría que podríamos afirmar, sin temor a equivocarnos, que este relativo éxito de todas nuestras intervenciones, de nuestros proyectos, de nuestras iniciativas en esta materia, pasan y tienen que seguir pasando por un diálogo honesto entre los distintos actores involucrados, pero en especial cuando se incorporan plenamente las necesidades de los países y de las propias comunidades vulnerabilizadas o de las comunidades beneficiarias de todo lo que nosotros hacemos finalmente. Aquí lo dejaría porque ya se me agotó el tiempo, pero por supuesto quedo atento para abarcar alguna pregunta si hay de la audiencia o conversar con mis colegas Amali o Dina. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Juan. Ha sido un placer escucharte. Seguimos entonces para nuestra tercera y última ponente, Amali Tower. Amali Tower has extensive experience promoting the rights and protection of refugees and forced displacement persons in a variety of contexts, including resettlement, protection, evaluation, and research with UNHCR, various NGOs, and the U.S. Refugee Administration Program through Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the U.S. She has resettled refugees, campaigned for refugees and asylum protections, written and passed U.S. legislation to curb immigration detention. Amali is also a member of the World Economic Forum and its expert network in migration, human rights, and humanitarian response. Es una alegría poder tener a Amali, que en este momento está en Los Ángeles y también ha sido un esfuerzo, así como ha sido un esfuerzo para Juan Carlos por la diferencia horaria de poder estar aquí y desde el comité organizador para nosotros nos gustaría agradeceros. Bueno, entonces, welcome Amali, the word is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me here today. As you said, yes, I'm here in Los Angeles, away from home, so it's nice to see you all today, all around the world. It's early morning here. Yes, just to correct a few organizations that I heard my name attached to. I'm actually the founder and executive director of Climate Refugees, but I have worked for those other organizations, UNHCR and the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, which is, of course, a program of the U.S. government. But I'm here today in my capacity with Climate Refugees. So having that corrected, thank you again to the organizers for inviting me here today. Thank you also to both Dina, it's lovely to see you again. Juan Carlos, nice to meet you today virtually. Unfortunately, I didn't have translation, and so I didn't get everything you said. However, I am familiar with the work of the PDD, so hopefully I know the gist of what you said, and we can have a good exchange. Thank you both then for your thoughtful remarks. And I do want to just take a moment and thank you both for the enormity of the work that both of your organizations are undertaking, especially, in the international realm as international, intergovernmental and state-led organizations. Now, in my work, I'm strongly focused on areas of forced displacement or forced migration. And Dina spoke a lot about migration as adaptation as well, which I wholly agree with. So I want to narrow my comments to talking about areas that I've traditionally worked in, which is situations where people are forced to move. So when migration is not really purely driven by choice, we would say, and this space of migration in a voluntary nature is narrowing. And I think we are seeing that more broadly in both internal and cross-border numbers. I think we all know that we're dealing with, well over 80 million people now are the numbers, and we know the latest grid report that Dina referenced, where internal displacements are now 3 times greater or are driven by weather-related, climate change, environmental forces are driving internal displacement even more than conflict or violence. So in preparing remarks for today's sessions, I was struck by the name of this session, the role of international organizations. I suppose then we're discussing the role and response of international organizations. But I think there's also a need to consider the responsibility of international organizations. And in that lens, migration needs to be, I would say, reimagined through a human security lens. As has always been the case, migration and even displacement is never the result of one driver. Climate change alone does not force migration. It is the capacity of climate change to heighten and create social, political, and economic disruptions, similar to what we currently see in the COVID-19 pandemic that disrupts human security and drives forced migration. We know that migration as adaptation, which Dina spoke about so well, cannot be the only solution we support, for many will be left behind, and many already are. Many are often trapped in situations, whether it be conflict, violence, or ever more growing environmental stressors. Most populations are trapped and are unable actually to move even within their countries, right? We also know that the UN Secretary General tells us that of the 15 countries most vulnerable to climate change, 8 already host UN peacekeeping or political missions. So people in armed conflict, who are already, of course, vulnerable to forced migration, we can say then are disproportionately impacted by climate shocks and environmental degradation. This is something we certainly can't ignore in a situation where we are already overwhelmed by the largest numbers of forced, of migrants and displaced persons that we've ever dealt with. And we are not really responding as well as we could be because we're under-resourced to the needs. So in 12 of those 20 countries, most vulnerable to climate change are already in conflict. We know that, the ICRC has done quite a lot of work here to say that the conflict sharply increases the fragility of institutions, essential services, infrastructure, and governance that are critical for strengthening people's resilience to a changing climate and environment. And this is certainly what I've heard when I've been in conflict countries where populations have been displaced by conflict and both environmental stressors, where stakeholders have essentially put it this way: the conflict inhibits state and institutional abilities towards climate resilience, and the climate conditions are also, progressing so rapidly, and the underdevelopment that is also sort of like concurrently at pace are also concurrent inhibitors. So you have this situation in which you have like 2 negative forces that essentially to sort of erode a state and a population's social, strength and capacity to withstand the impacts of slow onset climate change. And you're seeing that more and more and more. And so when you see that happening in countries that are already, in fragile situations, you have sort of a recipe for some very vulnerable situations. People in fragile settings, those with risk exposures that overwhelm the coping capacity of a state, are disproportionately affected by climate change and environmental degradation. Now, according to the UN Peacebuilding Commission and Fund, 70% of the most climate vulnerable countries are also the most fragile countries. By both measures, this acutely hinders resilience measures and adaptive capacity to climate change effects because of the political, economic, social factors and disruptions. Just exactly what I was saying and what I've heard. And the Lake Chad Basin is a really prime example of where I heard that again and again and again. Extreme weather-related events now drive internal displacement more than climate change, as I said. And in these internal displacement situations, I think it's always important to remember that human protection needs are no less. Dina can of course speak best to the work that IOM is doing in Somalia, where you have so many more IDPs even, or just as many maybe growing as Somali refugees across borders in Kenya and really globally, where Somali IDPs are, essentially in situations where they have to be resettled, if you will, within their own country because they can't even return to their original homes within the country. So, we have a situation in which the whole landscape of what we have traditionally, the tools that we've had and the ways that we have traditionally dealt with forced migration or rather forced displacement here are rapidly changing, but we don't necessarily have the tools for adequate response. So in that scenario, I think from my perspective and the work that I do advocating for policy changes that we need, I would say that we can no longer tolerate state-led responses that prioritize state security over human security. And if migration is a form of adaptation, then a parallel process of open borders that permits irregular migration even, safe pathways, humanitarian visas needs to be facilitated. And a lot of the migration that you do see take place is actually predictive. There aren't sort of crises of people that are arriving. We actually have data and statistics that can tell us that a lot of the arrivals that you see can be rather predictive and can be responded to through predictive state policies. If it is a form of adaptation as well, then it needs to be financed as such, and the loss and damage mechanism should support such. I mean, this is possibly one such avenue that we haven't explored. Instead, countries have yet to even meet their pledges, right, of the $100 billion a year for climate adaptation funding, which is woefully inadequate. So we have tools, as has been so well articulated, but I think that, we have to also point out that we aren't meeting the full potential of utilizing the tools that we do have. And as Dina pointed out, a lot of this is, of course, because migration and admittance and stay is very much at the will of states. We now, though, are seeing some sort of changes and shifts in the tone, right? We do now have UN member states pushing for loss and damage compensation for situations where they are forced into climate refugee situations. They are actually using this term. I point to earlier this year, the UN Security Council's open debate on climate and security, where many UN member states actually used this term and called for compensation through the loss and damage mechanism. It would seem to me then, the conversation from my perspective, from my organization's work, a justice framework is lacking. A human rights-based approach needs to be more deliberately incorporated. We need stronger linkages that across the UN then that apply that human rights-based approach that incorporates migration into the work of sustainability, into the work of peace and security, human rights, development, and so on. Instead of sort of working as we have for quite some time, even post-2010, on migration as a traditional siloed approach. And migration isn't the only way, only thing that we deal with in a siloed approach. We tend to topically deal with issues very siloed. And I think where we see that this isn't quite how things work, right? We're talking about situations, I think all three of us have mentioned, that are social as well. So there's a need to sort of like see the interconnectedness of issues and then thus the disruptive nature of a chain. Not only then are we dealing with situations of limited open borders, but we're also dealing with limited legal protections. I certainly understand the reticence to use the term climate refugee or to apply any kind of refugee lens to this conversation. And that is purely based on the fact that the term doesn't fit as per the 1951 Refugee Convention's definition. That said, the term migrant also has no legal definition, and to use a term that has no legal definition that also implies a voluntary nature in situations that are less and less voluntary is genuinely bewildering because it doesn't exactly capture the enforced and threatening and human rights conditions that are certainly sort of violating the rights and the protections and limiting the space of that for vast numbers of the populations out there who incidentally had very little role in contributing to the problems and the effects of climate change to begin with. We all know the statistics. We all know the truth. The vast majority of the global population that are paying for the ill effects of climate change are those who contributed the very least. And so to not speak about this in terms of justice, to not speak about this in terms of a human rights-based approach, to not speak about this in terms of protection and the breakdown in the enjoyment of human rights, I think is a huge gap. So it's and it's a gap in our international system that we can no longer ignore. And that is the lens and perspective from which we come from. Now, I'm happy to note that individual case developments in human rights law has obviously been very helpful in this regard. And legal developments have shown climate change related migration is, it's not just a climate issue, it's a human rights issue. Just this year alone, we had a French court rule that in favor of a Bangladeshi migrant, granting him residency on the grounds that the air pollution in his home country coupled with his own health condition, deemed it unsafe for his return. Last year, you had the UN Human Rights Commission, uphold the principle of non-refoulement, which is, of course, the cornerstone of refugee law, ruling that states could not deport individuals who face climate change-induced conditions that violate the right to life. Of course, as enshrined in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Understanding that forced displacement threatens a vast array of human rights, the 2019 Parliamentary Assembly resolution of the Council of Europe noted that the absence of legally binding definition for, quote, climate refugees, that's a term they use, does not preclude the possibility of developing specific policies to protect people who are forced to move as a consequence of climate change. Further calling on its member states to develop in their asylum systems and international law protection for people fleeing long-term climate change. They also went on to point out the particular responsibility of European states to countries in the global South for the disproportionate impacts that they would, of course, bear. And then, of course, from October of last year, we have UNHCR's recent legal considerations that the 1951 Refugee Convention can apply in situations where climate change impacts adversely exacerbate situations, where political, economic, social, or structural instability exists, or in situations where the adverse effects of climate change give rise to or exacerbate discrimination. The right to a healthy environment is now incorporated in 156. I think that might even maybe be slightly higher right now of 193 UN member states in their constitutions, in their legislations, in regional human rights instruments, and so forth. In 2018, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment presented the framework principles on human rights and the environment to the UN Human Rights Council, illustrating its widespread global acceptance. Here in the United States, where I'm based in New York City, I've been doing quite a bit of work with fellow advocates, where the U.S. government, albeit has all kinds of challenges, contrary to much of the principles that I'm speaking about here, on its own borders in terms of asylum policy, and yet is very interested in understanding how it can offer greater protection within its refugee program to climate displaced populations. So we're certainly seeing a shift. We're seeing an understanding that there are limits in both our legal tools, our protection tools, and in our programmatic tools. And I think that this is certainly a strong and hopeful note that I will end my presentation on. Thank you.
Thank you, Amali. So it was a pleasure to listen to you. So now I invite all the speakers to join the center of the debate. Y a Jesús también. Sí, ya estamos. Perfecto. And we have a lot of questions from the public in YouTube and also in the chat here. I hope that we have time to discuss all the topics that emerge in your brilliant speeches. So I will start with a comment from Alejandra Mancia, that it's a researcher of the University of Oslo. She said that she really liked the perspective of Dina Ionesco to see migration as a win-win situation and not as a zero-sum game. She also agreed that it's necessary to change the language. In political theory, that is her expertise, immigrants are frequently treated as burden, and the question is how to distribute this burden. In this sense, creating a category of environmental refugees, she thinks would be a way to deepen the approach that victimizes the others and takes away their autonomy, with the receiving states deciding their future for them. How to change the burden of proof, how to begin to see migration as a process that will always be with us, and that should be embraced rather than fear. So this is the question from Alejandra Mancia. And I also think that there is a lot of interfaces with the question from Clara Piqueras, that it's our colleague in the CER-MIGRACIONS. Clara Piqueras' question. For the work of organizations, whether they are local or international, no governmental or governmental, the framework is crucial. Environmental migrations, due to their complexity, make it difficult to establish a precise framework. So she's question to all of you, what is your opinion on the most appropriate framework for environmental migration? Would be the refugee lenses mentioned by Amali the best one? So this is our questions on the framework that I think from Clara Piqueras and Alejandra Mancia, there is a lot of interfaces. We have two other questions that I think touches another subject, that it's the global pact. So Brady Ferguson in YouTube question, what's your interpretation of the global compact, its positive aspects and its shortcomings? How important is it to push countries who have not joined the global compact for migration to join? Should people living in those countries advocate for that, or are there higher priorities? So we have these questions on the global compact. I'm pretty sure that these two aspects will be sufficient for another roundtable. So I'm giving to you, to all of you, 5 minutes to talk about the framework and to talk about the global compact. And we can start with Dina Ionesco.
Okay, thank you for giving back the floor, and thank you to Amali and to Juan Carlos. Because also, just to say in my 5 minutes, my admiration for the work of Amali, who created this climate refugee own structure. I find this is amazing. And also for Juan Carlos, as IOM and PDD work so closely together, we are very used to work together, in fact, on many programs. But I wanted to say this. And also thank you for these great questions. So now for the questions from my, what I take away from what we discussed before and from the questions, and what I strongly believe, it's that there's no one solution. And we are too often pushed in saying that's the solution or that's the best way to do it. I really believe humanity and work on migration and migration itself, it's about what I said before, it's about nuances, it's about losing and gaining, it's about being sad and being happy, it's about learning and changing, it's about the complexity of humanity. So there is no one single solution, there is a wide range of solutions. That's why I try to explain how at IOM we try to cluster them in 3 big chunks that are in fact with different objectives. But I really think for me, the response, it's that we should not oppose in any way this solution. So helping people to stay, giving them livelihoods, allowing them not to move. If they don't want to move, it's not contradictory, in fact, at all with protecting people who unfortunately are displaced, or with allowing people to move because they want to move. Nothing, it's in fact contradictory. We need all these kind of solutions. So it's key that human rights approaches at every level. And for this topic, human rights-based approaches are key. And non-refoulement, it's key. The Kiribati case was very interesting from this point of view, but it shows also this case that the threshold to showcase that the risk for the people was so high that it did not apply. So that there is always something that comes sometimes even against very basic non-refoulement and clear human rights approaches, then because it's so complicated. And that's why also I'm saying I don't think that climate refugee as such might be the best and easiest solution. Also because I work with states and I see not really an appetite to really open or change these things, but also because I'm aware and a bit worried that in fact we'll create a new box, and someone who's poor but can't show that he's poor because of desertification due to climate change, what do we do with this person? You know, what kind of protection? That's why, to respond also to the second question, and I think where IOM and the platform on disaster displacement are aligned, it's also what we see as the implementation, for instance, of the Nansen protection agenda and of the global compact on migration. So that brings me to the question on the global compact on migration as well. I think it's the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda, the GCM showcase this range of possible solutions so that you can, for instance, in some situation, review your national policy so that you have already a category of temporary protection in case of crisis, that you look on the long term who is your neighbor, what are the issues, with which countries you are engaging, and think long-term on bilateral agreements or on labor migration as part of the solution. To look at regional, I think the regional governance approach, it's what works best in terms of international migration nowadays. And we see, we have the case of the Caribbean, we have the case of the Pacific, of the Indian Ocean, of West Africa, South Africa, Central America, Southern Americas. We have all these regional consultative processes and regional organizations that are gaining now the awareness that you can have free movement protocols that allow already a fluidity of movements at regional level. So in case of a crisis, this is part of the response. But once again, I think we need strong human security approaches. We need strong human rights-based approaches. We need all protection you can get from all kind of legal domains, also environmental migration, environmental law, disaster law. We have to pick in all of those to create a rainbow of a range of possible solutions. But I also very strongly believe that you need to be innovative and to see migration differently, to change the narrative, to see this positive. And I think that's where it's key also, the definitions. And for instance, we see more and more the use of displacement to speak of forced form of migration growing. But migration is also such a complex word. And as you said, Amali, there's no one single legal definition. But we have also, for instance, in the case of COVID-19, we saw seasonal migration, internal migration, people being stuck who usually resort to seasonal migration and lost this access to it. So many different situations, and I will also share with you and with the audience the link to our 2019 glossary on terminology of migration, where we explain exactly when do we use environmental migrants, when do we use internally displaced people, when do we use disaster displacement, when do we use voluntarily migration, when do we use internal migration. I think it's not agreed upon, there's no one single definition, but we have to contextualize each time. And it has an impact on our operation. It's not just blah, blah. It's not just definition. It has an impact on protection. It has an impact on rights. It has an impact on our operations. And to close what I think I know more than 5 minutes, I apologize for this, just on the GCM. I just want to say something. I've been working now on migration for 15 years. And I think the GCM, it's not like ideal, but it's the first time that we have a document that has been negotiated by states that really looks at migration globally, and that has very strong language on environment, on environmental degradation, on disasters, on climate change, and also connects to the SDGs, connects to Sendai, connects to the Paris Agreement. So we have this, let's use it. Then to use it, just to highlight, we have a new work stream on migration and climate change, just launched now at the level of the United Nations network on migration. So we have a special work stream devoted to this, where different stakeholders commit with different engagements to have outputs on migration and climate change. And I believe the implementation of the GCM at regional and national level, and the role of countries that are now taking somehow a championship of this implementation, will be key. And I'm convinced, and that's why I work, I think also at IOM, I'm also convinced that to work with policymakers, it's super important. To work with states, it's very important. Even if it's not what you always would want when you are an advocate. If you are a passionaria of the rights of migrants, sometimes it's not easy, because these discussions sometimes are the lowest common denominator and not where you would want, because it's among states with different governmental vision. But that's the way it is, and it has such a value that it exists. We can't afford not to have this space of discussion. And I believe that better policies will mean better responses and protection for people. And IOM's vision is to translate our activities into services for migrants, but to do so, we work with the governments to achieve that. So I think we should be very careful not to be excessively like naive or idealistic or about the migration discussion at governmental level, and at the same time not to go the other way around and say it's useless, it's for nothing. No, I think that it's a very strong purpose to enhance multilateralism and to create good policies. So, and I'm over a lot 5 minutes over my 5 minutes. I apologize. I got passionate about it, but yes. So GCM, not perfect, but super useful, I think.
Perfect, Dina. There is no problem because our first plan was to have 2 rounds of 5 minutes. So we can have only one with 10 minutes. So I'm giving to all of you 10 minutes, okay? Now we can have Juan Carlos.
Thank you, Thales. Both questions are valid and extremely relevant. But as you said, Thales, I mean, we can spend 1 week, 1 full week discussing the appropriate way to address this complex phenomenon. And honestly, I mean, we've spent so much time and energy trying to figure out the best way to address this phenomenon. Are they climate refugees? Are they environmental migrants? Are they something in between? I mean, why don't we focus, as you rightly put it, Amali, why don't we focus on trying to use current tools and try to reach a full potential of those existing tools using this justice framework and a clear human rights approach. I like that from your intervention, Amali. But regardless of what I personally believe, let me just make a pause. And again, I'm sorry, Amali, I'm gonna switch back to Spanish and say a few words on how the international community is addressing this issue. And I only use a couple of minutes to say a few words on that, and then I will comment on the GCM. El problema con la mejor aproximación a este fenómeno es que no hay un acuerdo jurídicamente vinculante que agrupe la complejidad de la movilidad humana en el contexto de desastres y cambio climático. Por eso es que hablamos tanto y discutimos tanto en círculos académicos y políticos cuál es la mejor forma de abordarlo. Hay un problema con el tema de climate refugees, como ustedes saben, y yo creo que ya ustedes lo han discutido mucho esta semana, ¿verdad? Que tiene que ver con un tema jurídico. Por supuesto, aquí tenemos en la audiencia y que nos acompañan gente espectacularmente que han hecho tesis sobre el tema, fantásticas, pero bueno, hay un tema de geopolítica, como Dina decía, efectivamente los países no tienen apetito para abrir discusiones sobre el tema de la Convención del 51, hay un tema de atribución, esto del welfare, ¿verdad?, de persecución, hay un tema de atribución, pero también hay un tema de que efectivamente la mayoría de personas se desplazan a nivel interno y no cruzan una frontera. Pero también hay otro problema con esta aproximación y tiene que ver con el mismo concepto que podría discriminar otro tipo de eventos que no se derivan precisamente de cambio climático, sino que tienen que ver con eventos de origen geofísico. Pensemos, por ejemplo, en terremotos o en erupción volcánica, ¿verdad? Que no tienen que ver con cambio climático precisamente, pero que efectivamente pueden desplazar personas. Veamos, por ejemplo, lo que pasó hace unos días con el volcán Neringongon, ¿verdad? Que desplazó más de 300.000 personas en pocas horas, y ese es un típico ejemplo de desplazamiento transfronterizo que no tiene que ver con cambio climático. También está el tema, por supuesto, de los lentes de la gestión migratoria, y aquí la OIM ha utilizado esta definición de environmental migration desde el 2007, ya es una definición de trabajo que usa la OIM desde hace bastantes años, que podría ser un poco más un poco más apropiada, pero ciertamente tiene algunas dificultades, como decía Amali, porque con el paso de los años nos damos cuenta que efectivamente cada vez menos las personas tienen este agency, como dicen en inglés, y cada vez menos las personas se movilizan de manera voluntaria. Entonces ese concepto de voluntariedad es el que podría generar alguna dificultad al utilizar el concepto de migración climática. Y bueno, y hay algunas otras propuestas in between, como decía Dina, que tienen que ver con esta toolbox approach que se deriva de la Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda y que tiene, digamos, un enfoque de gestión de riesgo de desastres, el tema de exposición, de vulnerabilidad, etcétera. En fin, yo no voy a hacer un advocate por ninguna propuesta. Yo creo que la comunidad internacional ha avanzado bastante en los últimos años. Debemos enfocarnos en la protección de los derechos humanos, como decía muy bien Dina, la protección de los derechos humanos en todo el ciclo de movilidad. Yo creo que ese debería ser el enfoque más apropiado que debemos utilizar como comunidad internacional. Pero ciertamente hay que visibilizar los retos que tienen ese tipo de definiciones para avanzar, digamos, en una mejor protección de estas poblaciones. Finalmente, ya me pasé también 5 minutos, me pasó igual que Dina, pero quisiera simplemente un par de ideas comentar con relación al Pacto Mundial sobre Migración. Yo estoy muy, digamos, emocionado con el Pacto Mundial sobre Migración. El GCM es un hito histórico. Nunca antes en el contexto de Naciones Unidas habíamos tenido un pacto de este nivel que, aunque no es vinculante, es la primera vez que los países logran integrar, por lo menos claramente, las dificultades, los retos que implica la movilidad humana asociada a cambio climático y desastres. No fue fácil, les cuento. Yo participé en algunas rondas de negociación en Nueva York, en algún momento inclusive participé como parte de una delegación, tomé la palabra, dijimos algunas cosas, y todo el tema de cambio climático y desastres, no querían algunos países que estuviera ahí. Fueron fuertes negociaciones, con lo cual vean ustedes que tampoco es que estamos en una situación en donde la comunidad internacional está en la misma página. Fue muy difícil lograr visibilizar las realidades de cambio climático y desastres y sus impactos en la movilidad de las personas. Algunos países estuvieron férreamente opuestos a que se incluyeran estas consideraciones y al final, gracias a un trabajo mancomunado de países de América Latina, de África y bastantes de Europa, fue que se logró que el GCM tuviera ahora un subcapítulo sobre el tema dentro del objetivo número 2. Pero eso también implicó rondas adicionales de negociación. Y como digo, aunque no es un tratado vinculante, ciertamente es muy interesante las posibilidades que le brinda a los estados de efectivamente lograr vías seguras para un fenómeno que está lejos de acabar. Las proyecciones no son nada alentadoras, como ustedes saben, y si no tomamos decisiones certeras y decisivas ya, posiblemente los números van a ser reales en el futuro.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias, Juan. It was a pleasure to listen to you. So now I'm give the word to our last speaker, Amali.
Hello, hi. Sorry, I lost connection, so I'm just back on. Sorry if I missed you all for a few minutes. I assume we're still talking about the last 2 questions about the GCM and tools and okay. Very good questions. I think we just have a few minutes. Is that correct? So I will just add on to the very fine points both my dear colleagues have made. And say that, you know, I think we have a number of tools underutilized. The GCM, which has been spoken very well and at length about, the Global Compact for Migration, non-binding as it is the beginning and has a framework which has so much potential. And so many tools, and as Dina pointed out, so many what is the right word, Dina? So many opportunities, right? That it presents. That for, you know, both positively, but also maybe as a challenge, are at the behest of state willingness, shall we say. And so that can be, that can present its challenges, but also its opportunities, right? And this is the system in which we live. So let's be fair and honest as the question was posed. We live in a world that is rather hostile towards migrants and immigrants. I certainly know that from personal experience. You know, I think all of us do, right? There's a lack of understanding, and I think that gets to the heart of what it is that I would like to say is happening in this conversation. Even our policymakers don't quite understand the value of migrants, even economically, right? As to Dina's point about COVID and how that sort of impacted seasonal migration. If you look at remittances and how much, you know, that actually supports national economies, how much labor migration, and you know, there are several good studies that have shown correlations between climate impacts in a certain country. Take the University of Ghana, for example. I think it was 2018 that showed fishermen who were able to sort of seasonally migrate because of climate impacts that impacted their trade. And then by migrating and the remittances that they were able to send back home, that you could see the positive net outcomes for both the home countries as well as the countries that they were, you know, had migrated to, that the net gains. Now there are also studies that show hypothetical models of if climate change does pose the sort of large numbers, and I do want us to stray away from a lot of the horrible terminology that is coined with migrations, like masses and floods and you know, some of the very sort of negative connotations that brings up. But if the modeling out there, which I think can be largely problematic as well, there are studies that show if the large numbers of people that might be forced to move, you know, do end up moving to places like Europe and the United States, what might that actually present in terms of like positive outcomes? And some of those studies have shown, in fact, that, you know, actually economically, there's a lot to be gained. There's a lot of like support that this could bring to countries like within Europe and in North America, which politically speaking, the rhetoric doesn't quite support, right? So you have economic net, you know, positivity that studies show that isn't necessarily supportive of the political rhetoric from politicians. And I think this is really interesting and important information that should sort of like trickle up in our policy conversation and our dialogues, because what has traditionally sort of happened is our political posturing and our responses to crises are often disconnected, right? We end up responding to the needs of forced migration, forced displacement scenarios that reach an apex. And when we do so, it's to do that in sort of like a crisis scenario or in a humanitarian situation or in compounding situations, instead of recognizing the positive attributions, recognizing, you know, the reality of people being forced to move, and therefore, and making those connects that I'm speaking of. That is to say that the political rhetoric doesn't really quite match up with the reality of expectations. So there's a lot of education that we need to do with the general public, but also with our own policymakers. And what I alluded to earlier about here in the United States, with some of the interests that this present administration has shown, I think this is incredibly positive. You know, this gives me hope on a personal front. And there are individual, you know, elected officials that are doing some really positive work in that vein. We are out of time, so I'll just leave it on these very positive notes, which is actually quite strange for me. It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Amali. Thank you, Dina. Thank you, Juan. It was a pleasure for us to have you all here, to have the audience. And in the name of the organizing committee, for us, it's been a wonderful, wonderful week. So just to put an end of this amazing event, thank you, everybody. And I'm also giving the word to Maria Jesús Herrera to say goodbye. Maria, you are muted.
Oh, perdón. Muchas gracias a todos y a todas por vuestras intervenciones. Ha sido un placer apoyar en la organización de estas jornadas y espero pues que hayan sido del agrado de todos, y desde la OIM desde luego hemos intentado que así lo sea. Thank you very much for your interventions, and really very interested, and I hope everybody will be happy and to know much more now what we are talking about in environment and migration, and have a nice time for everybody, and thank you very much.
Bye, thank you all.
Bye,
Gracias.
adiós, muchas gracias, hasta pronto.
Okay.
Hasta pronto.
Bye.